in the comfortable haze of an officer's mess, somewhere in occupied France, late 1941. The war, for them, was a string of victories. And this was a curiosity, a grainy intelligence photo passed from hand to hand. It showed a vehicle, small, boxy, ugly. It had no doors, no real roof. To men whose world was defined by the granite bulk of Tiger tanks and the thunderous authority of the 88mm gun, this American oddity was laughable, Spielzeug, one of them sneered. A toy. Their arrogance was a product of their doctrine. They waged war with a sledgehammer. Theirs was a philosophy of the Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort, where concentrated steel would shatter an enemy line. By their calculus, this Jeep was nothing, zero. It had no armor to stop a bullet, no cannon to command respect. It was a symbol, they thought, of a naive nation, an industrial giant trying to build a war machine and coming up with a goat cart. What their arrogance blinded them to was the genius in its simplicity. They saw fragility. They missed agility. They saw a lack of armament. They missed a blank canvas for versatility. Most critically, they saw a single vehicle. They failed to comprehend the tidal wave of production behind it, while German engineers painstakingly hand-finished the complex, interleaved road wheels of a single Panther tank. A factory in Toledo, Ohio, was stamping out Jeep chassis every few minutes. This was not a weapon designed to win a duel. It was a tool designed to win a war of logistics. It was the circulatory system of a modern army, the humble capillary that would carry the lifeblood of ammunition, food, and orders to the very fingertips of the front. The Jeep was a paradox. It was humble, yet it would become indispensable. It would carry generals into the heart of battle and carry wounded men back from the brink. It would be a reconnaissance scout, a mobile command post, an ambulance, a gun platform. It would lay communication wire and improbably even become a makeshift locomotive. It was the embodiment of American adaptability, the very quality the rigid, albeit brilliant, German war machine fatally lacked. The smirk of those officers in 1941 was a symptom of a terminal disease, the disease of fighting the last war. They were prepared for a war of set pieces and fixed lines. But the Jeep was the herald of a new kind of war, a war of relentless motion, of overwhelming supply, of sheer, inexorable pressure. But what the Germans dismissed as a joke was about to become their nightmare. To understand the Jeep's revolution, you must first see the world it was born into, a world of mud and muscle. In the 1930s, the image of a modern army was a lie. While propaganda reels showed sleek tanks and screaming Stuka dive bombers, the true backbone of every European military was the same as it had been for Napoleon, the horse. The German blitzkrieg that stunned the world in 1939 and 1940 was a brilliant but thin spearhead. Behind the panzers, the supply columns that fueled the advance were a chaotic mix of slow, bulky trucks and hundreds of thousands of horses. The Wehrmacht entered Russia with over 600,000 horses. These animals hauled ammunition, pulled artillery, and moved the endless tons of fodder needed to feed themselves. They were slow. They required vast logistical support. They died in the freezing cold, creating bottlenecks of flesh and bone that stranded entire divisions. This was the Achilles heel of modern warfare, tactical brilliance hamstrung by strategic immobility. An army could strike with lightning speed, but it could only move as fast as its slowest supply wagon. The same was true for the storied French army and the British Expeditionary Force. They were, at their core, armies of the 19th century, struggling to operate in the 20th across the Atlantic. A small group of American officers watched this unfolding chaos with grim understanding. They saw the problem not in terms of tactics, but of physics. The future of war was not just about firepower, but about velocity, the speed of movement, of decision, of supply. They dreamed of a fully motorized force, an army where every soldier, every weapon, every crate of rations moved on wheels. But the existing vehicles were not the answer. Standard trucks were too large, too heavy, too thirsty for fuel. They bogged down in anything softer than a paved road. They were easy targets for aircraft. The motorcycle with a sidecar, a staple of reconnaissance units, was unstable, exposed, and could carry almost nothing. What was needed was something that didn't exist. A vehicle that combined the toughness of a truck, the agility of a motorcycle, and the light footprint of a mule. It had to be small enough to be packed into the hold of an aircraft or landed on a hostile beach. It had to be simple enough to be repaired by a teenager with a wrench under enemy fire. It had to be a mechanical ghost, able to go anywhere, carry anything, and do everything. The U.S. Army sent out a desperate challenge to American industry, a set of specifications that seemed to defy the laws of engineering. They demanded the impossible, a lightweight four-wheel drive reconnaissance car that could outperform anything on the planet. The deadline was unthinkable, just 49 days to deliver a working prototype. The U.S. Army sent out a desperate challenge to American industry. Build us the impossible car. The request for proposals landed on the desks of America's automakers like a declaration of war. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Technical Committee was not asking for an improvement. They were demanding a revolution, and they wanted it yesterday. The specifications were brutal. A vehicle weighing no more than 300 pounds, four-wheel drive, capable of carrying a 600-pound payload. The timeline was widely considered insane. 49 days to deliver a fully functional prototype. Most major manufacturers, including General Motors and Chrysler, took one look at the requirements and walked away. It was a suicide mission, but in the shadows of industry giants, three companies saw not impossibility, but destiny. The American Bantam Car Company, a tiny, struggling firm on the brink of collapse, saw this as its last chance for survival. They had nothing to lose. Willys Overland, a mid-sized manufacturer known for rugged vehicles, saw a chance to prove its mettle. And Ford, the industrial titan, saw an opportunity to dominate yet another landscape. The race began on a knife's edge. Bantam, with no engineering staff to spare, made a desperate call. They turned to a brilliant, freelance automotive designer named Karl Probst. Probst was given a stark ultimatum: design the entire vehicle from the ground up in just 5 days. He locked himself away and in an incredible burst of genius produced a complete set of blueprints. The legend says the first sketches were scrawled on a napkin. The reality was just as dramatic. Probst worked without a contract, on nothing but a handshake and a belief in the mission. Meanwhile, Bantam's factory in Butler, Pennsylvania, became a 24-hour crucible of innovation. Men worked in shifts around the clock, their faces lit by the sparks of welding torches. They scavenged parts from other vehicles, modified existing components, and invented solutions on the fly. The pressure was immense. An army officer was stationed in the factory, watching their every move, his presence a constant reminder of the ticking clock. Willys and Ford, confident in their larger resources, took a more measured approach, believing the army would extend the deadline. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Bantam, fueled by desperation, pushed forward relentlessly. The climax came on September 23, 1940. With just hours to spare, the Bantam team completed their prototype. Dubbed the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or Blitz Buggy, it was driven under its own power from the factory to the Army's testing ground at Camp Holabird, Maryland. The journey itself was a test, a 200-mile gauntlet that the fragile, untested vehicle miraculously survived. When the Army inspectors saw it, they were stunned. This small, gritty team from a failing company had actually done it. The vehicle was there. It was real. It met the weight requirement almost. It had four-wheel drive. It worked. The Bantam prototype proved the impossible was possible. It validated the Army's entire concept, but the military, fearing tiny Bantam lacked the production capacity to build an army's worth of vehicles, did something controversial. They handed Bantam's meticulously crafted blueprints to Willys and Ford, inviting them to build their own versions. The race was not over. It had just entered a new, more brutal phase. From a sketch on a napkin, a legend rolled to life. What emerged from that frantic competition was not a work of art, but a tool of pure function. The Jeep in its final form was a masterpiece of brutalist engineering. There was no fat on it, no wasted motion or material. It was a machine stripped to its essential purpose, to endure. At its heart was the Go Devil engine from Willys, a 4-cylinder powerhouse that was famously understressed. It wasn't built for speed, but for longevity. It could run for days, redlined on the lowest grade of fuel, and still ask for more. It was mounted on a chassis so strong that soldiers would later joke you could lift the entire vehicle by its bumper. The 4-wheel drive system was revolutionary in its simplicity. A single lever engaged it, locking the front and rear axles together to claw through mud, sand and snow that would swallow a truck. Its body was Spartan to the point of absurdity, a fold-down windshield for repair or for packing into a transport plane. A fuel tank tucked safely under the driver's seat, no doors. A canvas roof that was more suggestion than shelter. Every component was accessible, designed to be fixed by a soldier with a basic toolkit in the field. A broken axle? Replace it in under an hour. A shot-out radiator? Bypass it with a length of rubber hose. This was not a vehicle that required a German engineer with a doctorate. It required a determined kid with a wrench. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to the enemy's approach. German engineering was a pursuit of perfection. The Tiger tank was a technological marvel, a rolling fortress with overlapping road wheels, a stabilized gun, and armor that could defy most Allied shells. But it was also a mechanical diva. It broke down constantly. It was so heavy it could barely cross a bridge. It guzzled precious fuel. It was the embodiment of over-engineering, a masterpiece that was often its own worst enemy. The Jeep was the antithesis of the Tiger. It represented a different kind of strength. Not the strength of impervious armor, but the strength of resilience. It was agile where the Tiger was clumsy. It was reliable where the Tiger was fragile. It was built not to win a duel, but to win a campaign. A Tiger could dominate a single crossroads. A Jeep could connect an entire front. It was this utilitarian genius that the German officers had failed to see in their intelligence photographs. They saw the lack of a cannon and dismissed it. They missed the fact that its low weight and nimble footprint allowed it to traverse narrow forest trails, cross shallow rivers, and move silently along ridges, places where no tank could ever follow. It was a ghost on the battlefield. It became the Army's universal tool. The same basic chassis served as an ambulance, a machine gun platform, a field telephone wire layer, a reconnaissance scout, and a command vehicle. It was more than a car. It was a platform, a blank slate upon which the chaos of war could write its own demands. The design was frozen. The factories were ready. Millions of tons of raw steel were waiting to be stamped into history, and soon this so-called toy would be tested in the fires of war. The first true test of the Jeep did not come on the green fields of Europe, but in the scorching, abrasive hell of the North African desert. Here, in Operation Torch, the American military-industrial complex met the reality of war for the first time. And the Jeep was at the forefront. The desert was a merciless proving ground. Fine, powder-like sand-choked engines, the sun-warped wood and cracked leather. The vast, trackless expanse demanded navigation skills as much as mechanical reliability. The bulky, 6-wheeled trucks the Army had relied on bogged down in the soft dunes. But the Jeep came alive. German and Italian commanders, veterans of the Desert War, were initially perplexed by sightings of these small, nimble vehicles zipping across the landscape. They watched as Jeeps performed tasks that seemed to defy logic. They saw them serving as the personal transports for generals like Patton and Rommel, not for comfort, but for utility. A commander could be at the front lines, assess the situation, and be back at his headquarters faster than a dispatch rider could even deliver a message. But it was in the hands of the common soldier that the Jeep truly earned its stripes. It became a universal mule. Jeeps hauled ammunition forward to advancing units, their light weight allowing them to traverse ground that would immobilize anything larger. They towed anti-tank guns into position, the little vehicles straining but never failing. When the fighting was over, those same jeeps, now with stretchers strapped across their hoods, evacuated the wounded, bouncing across the desert to field hospitals, saving countless lives. The Germans, who prided themselves on their own rugged Kettenkrad half-track motorcycles, were stunned by the jeep's sheer versatility and speed. Their vehicles were complex and specialized. The jeep was simple and did everything. A captured jeep, examined by Afrika Korps mechanics, elicited a grudging respect. Its simplicity was its armor. There was simply nothing on it that could easily break. One intelligence report from a German officer noted with alarm the ubiquity of the American vehicle. It was everywhere at once, a symptom of an enemy who seemed to have an endless supply of everything: fuel, spare parts, and willpower. The Jeep became a symbol of American logistical might, a tiny, four-wheeled proof that the United States could project power not just with bombs, but with an overwhelming flood of practical tools. The North African campaign was a brutal introduction to warfare. But for the Jeep, it was a triumphant validation. It had passed every test: heat, sand, distance, and enemy fire. It had transformed from a blueprint into a legend in the minds of the soldiers who depended on it. They had gone to Africa with doubts. They would leave with a faith in their odd little vehicle that bordered on affection, but its greatest challenge would come on the far side of the world, the jungles of the Pacific. If the desert tested the Jeep's engine, the jungle tested its soul. In the sweltering, claustrophobic green hell of the Pacific Islands and the Burmese frontier, the war contracted to a few yards of visibility. Here, the grand strategies of generals meant less than the reliability of the vehicle that brought you your rations and ammunition. Tanks were useless, bogged down in mud and trapped by giant trees. Trucks were confined to the few crude roads which were death traps for ambushes. But the Jeep, with its narrow wheelbase and incredible torque, could navigate narrow, winding native trails. It became the only mechanical link between the front line and the world beyond. But the jungle demanded innovation. Standard tactics were useless, so the soldiers invented new ones. They learned that a Jeep, with its windshield folded down, could be manhandled across makeshift log bridges over rivers that maps said were impassable. They discovered that by lashing planks to its sides, it could be transformed into a crude but effective amphibious vehicle, paddled across quiet lagoons to outflank Japanese positions. The most audacious feat was its delivery. In Burma, with General Ord Wingate's Chindits, and later with Merrill's marauders, Jeeps were taken apart. Their chassis, engines and bodies were separated, loaded into gliders or cargo planes, and airdropped into tiny jungle clearings behind enemy lines. On the ground, sweating, exhausted men would reassemble them like giant life-saving model kits. Within hours, these resurrected Jeeps were running supply routes, evacuating wounded, and providing mobile fire support with mounted machine guns, creating a sense of momentum in a stagnant war. For the Marine on Guadalcanal or the soldier in New Guinea, the sight of a Jeep bumping down a jungle track was more than a supply run. It was a psychological tether to sanity and survival. It meant food, mail from home, and a way out if you were hit. It was a piece of home, a symbol of the ingenuity that would, inch by grueling inch, push back the enemy. The Japanese, masters of jungle warfare who relied on light infantry and human supply chains, had no answer for this kind of motorized agility. They could ambush a column, but they could not stop the endless, adaptable flow of men and material that the Jeep represented. It was a logistics war, and the Jeep was winning it. The vehicle had conquered the desert and mastered the jungle. It had proven itself in every extreme environment the world could throw at it. But one challenge remained: the most heavily fortified coastline in history, and then came the ultimate test, D-Day. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the Jeep went to war on an industrial scale. As the ramps of the Higgins boat slammed down into the bloody surf of Omaha and Utah beaches, among the first vehicles to splash into the shallows were the jeeps. Waterproofed and laden with gear, they clawed their way up the sand, weaving through obstacles and fallen heroes. This was no longer a test. This was the final exam, and the jeep passed. In the days and weeks that followed, they poured into Europe not by the 100, but by the 1,000. They became the central nervous system of the Allied advance. A general like Eisenhower needed to see the front. A jeep could get him there. A radio unit needed to be mobile to coordinate air and artillery support. A jeep became its rolling command post. The wounded needed to get to a field hospital fast. A jeep, with stretchers strapped to its hood and fenders, was often the difference between life and death. It was in the close-quarters hell of the hedgerow country that the jeep's versatility saved entire units. The bocage, a labyrinth of ancient dirt-walled fields, was a death trap for tanks. But a jeep, small and quiet, could navigate the narrow, sunken lanes. It could deliver ammunition to a platoon pinned down by a hidden German machine gun nest. It could evacuate the wounded from a place no ambulance could reach. It was the thread that held the fraying fabric of the advance together. As the Allies broke out and the pursuit across France began, the jeep's true power was unleashed. The power of numbers. German commanders, accustomed to carefully husbanding their own complex, scarce vehicles, were baffled and then horrified by the ubiquity of the jeep. They were everywhere. Captured German officers, when shown the vast motor pools containing thousands of identical jeeps, simply shook their heads in disbelief. One remarked it was as if America had a magical tree from which these vehicles grew. They weren't facing an army. They were being overrun by an industrial ecosystem on wheels. The jeep became a prized trophy for the enemy. The Germans, chronically short of transport, used any captured jeeps they could find, a tacit admission of its superior design. But for every one they captured, 100 more took its place. This was the real secret the German officers had missed in 1941. The jeep's power wasn't in any single vehicle, but in the endless, replicable wave of them. It was a swarm. Through the brutal winter of 1944-45, during the Battle of the Bulge, the jeep proved indispensable once more. On icy roads that immobilized larger vehicles, the jeep, with its sure-footed four-wheel drive, kept moving. It rushed reinforcements to critical sectors like Bastogne, and it carried dispatches when radio communications failed. It was the artery that kept the isolated American defenders alive. By the spring of 1945, as the Allies drove into the heart of Germany, the jeep was more than a vehicle. It was an icon of liberation. It was the first American thing countless liberated prisoners and civilians saw rolling into their towns. It was a symbol of mobility, of freedom, of an end to the tyranny that had immobilized a continent. It had carried the army from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Berlin. It had done every job asked of it, and asked for nothing but a little gasoline and a rough patch of ground to call home. But this little car was about to take on a new identity, not just a weapon of war, but a symbol beyond the tactics and the tonnage. The jeep found its true soul in the hearts of the soldiers who drove it. They did not see a piece of machinery. They saw a companion. In a world of mud, death, and uncertainty, the jeep was a constant. It was reliable. It didn't complain. It was always there. And so the men gave it a name. They painted them with pin-ups and cartoon characters. They gave them fierce personal titles: Hell's Angel, the Jolly Roger, Old Ironsides. They adorned the hoods with kill marks not for tanks, but for miles driven. Near misses survived. A jeep wasn't just assigned to a unit. It was adopted by it. Crews would spend their rare moments of calm meticulously maintaining their vehicle, tuning the engine to a specific purr, knowing its quirks and sounds as well as they knew their own voices. Their lives depended on its health. Stories of this loyalty became legend. A driver would spend hours digging his buried jeep out of the mud, refusing to abandon it. Mechanics would perform battlefield surgery, cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles to keep their own running. There are accounts of jeeps riddled with shrapnel, missing fenders, their canvas tops in tatters, still chugging faithfully back to friendly lines with a load of wounded. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was the platoon's pet, its mascot, its silent, sturdy guardian. This affection was born from shared experience. The jeep had been there. It had been splattered with the same mud, shaken by the same artillery barrages, and provided the same thin shelter from the rain. It had carried them into hell, and just as importantly, it had carried them back. A soldier's connection to his rifle was one of survival. His connection to his jeep was one of partnership. This sentiment was echoed at the very top. After the war, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the architect of the European victory, was asked to list the most crucial tools that secured the Allied triumph. He didn't name the B-17 Flying Fortress or the Sherman tank. He named three humble workhorses: the Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport plane, the bazooka anti-tank weapon, and the Jeep. He understood that wars are won not by individual super weapons, but by the tools that empower the individual soldier, that create fluidity and resilience across the entire battlefield. The Jeep was the ultimate expression of that empowerment. It was democracy on four wheels. A private and a general rode in the same basic vehicle. It broke down the rigid hierarchy of war, creating a sense of shared mobile purpose. It was, for millions of GIs, a tangible piece of American ingenuity and freedom in a landscape dominated by oppression and destruction. It was home. It had been mocked, tested, and battle-hardened. It had become a brother-in-arms to the greatest generation, and when the war ended, the Jeep refused to retire. When the guns fell silent in 1945, a new problem emerged. What to do with 1 million war heroes made of steel? The answer was not to scrap them, but to set them free. The Jeep, having conquered the battlefields of the world, was now unleashed upon the home front, and it found a world ripe for its unique talents. Surplus Jeeps, sold for a few $100s, were snapped up by farmers, loggers, and ranchers. They discovered what the Army had known for years. Here was the most versatile tool they had ever owned. It could plow a field, haul timber, navigate treacherous mountain trails to reach remote cabins, and do the work of a tractor and a truck combined. It was unbreakable, cheap to run, and simple to fix. The vehicle that had been a lifeline for soldiers became a revolution for rural America. But its journey didn't stop at the farm gate. The public's imagination had been captured. This was the car that had won the war. It carried an aura of adventure, of rugged capability. Willys Overland, understanding this, made a brilliant, pivotal decision. They introduced the CJ, or civilian Jeep. It was the same rugged machine, now with a few concessions to comfort like a tailgate and a slightly softer suspension. It was an instant icon. The Jeep didn't just find a market, it created one. It spawned an entire industry, the off-road vehicle. It became the essential transport for scientists exploring the Amazon, for rangers patrolling national parks, for hunters and fishermen seeking the most isolated spots. It was the vehicle of choice for adventurers who saw the world not as a network of roads, but as a single, continuous landscape to be explored. The very qualities that made it a soldier, its go-anywhere attitude, its refusal to quit, were the same qualities that made it a legend in peacetime. Hollywood cemented its status. The Jeep appeared in countless post-war films and television shows, no longer a tool of war, but a symbol of American can-do spirit, of wholesome adventure. It was the vehicle of safari guides, archaeologists, and rugged heroes. The smirk of those German officers in 1941 had been transformed globally into a smile of admiration. The toy was now a dream machine. It proved that a design born from the most brutal necessities could become an instrument of peace and progress. The Jeep was more than a car. It was a philosophy of simplicity, durability, and limitless potential. It taught the world that true strength isn't about being the biggest or the most complex, but about being the most adaptable, the most resilient, But its greatest legacy wasn't just on roads and farms, it was in memory and myth. The arc of history is often bent not by the loudest thunder, but by the most persistent hum. In the grand, tragic opera of World War II, dominated by the scream of dive bombers and the earth-shattering roar of naval artillery, the story of the Jeep is a quiet, relentless refrain. It is the story of how a smirk of arrogance was met with the quiet confidence of innovation. Those German officers in 1941 were not foolish. They were simply looking at the world through a lens of an era that was already ending. They measured power in weight and caliber. They believed that the future of war would be decided by a clash of titans, steel behemoths dueling on a controlled battlefield. The Jeep represented the opposite of all that. It was light. It was weak by their definition. It was anonymous, and that was its ultimate strength. While the German war machine became a prisoner of its own complexity, bogging down in the mud of its logistical nightmares, the Jeep offered a terrifyingly simple solution: mobility. Not the flashy mobility of the Blitzkrieg, but a deep, systemic mobility that connected an entire army. It was the difference between having a mighty fist and having a fully functional nervous system. The fist could deliver a crushing blow, but the nervous system could adapt, react, and endure. The Jeep's triumph was a triumph of philosophy. It was the embodiment of American industrial democracy, functional, replicable, and accessible. It proved that overwhelming force wasn't just about the size of the explosion, but about the speed of the response, the resilience of the supply chain, and the ability to empower every single soldier on the ground. A general could change a battle plan at dawn, and by noon, that new plan could be enacted across a 50-mile front, because the Jeep could carry the orders, the commanders, and the ammunition to make it happen. It became a global icon, not because it was the most powerful weapon of the war, but because it was the most indispensable. It was the tool that enabled all the other tools to function. It was the humble private in an army of generals, doing the essential, unglamorous work that ultimately wins campaigns. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, the Jeep was there. It was a constant, a certainty in a world of chaos. The laughter of those officers in 1941 did not just fade. It was drowned out by the sound of millions of wheels rolling across continents. They had underestimated the power of simplicity, the strength of reliability, and the unstoppable force of an idea whose time had come. The Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a lesson that the greatest challenges are not always met with greater force, but with smarter design, with unwavering resilience, and with the quiet, unshakable belief that no obstacle is final. In the end, the Jeep proved that sometimes the smallest machine can carry the weight of the world.